Under chandeliers like frozen constellations, Lady Arabella Fairfax moved through her engagement ball as if in a dream she could not wake from. Every polished floorboard reflected her like a ghost, gloved, graceful, and pale beneath the weight of pearls her family could no longer afford. The orchestra played a waltz too bright for her mood. Laughter rippled through the room like champagne poured too quickly, fizzing, fleeting. She smiled when spoken to, her lips curving with the precision of a practiced debutante, though behind her fan her fingers trembled faintly, betraying what her eyes could not. She was 18, too young to have learned how to wear despair beautifully, yet already mastered at pretending. Her father's voice rose somewhere behind her, jovial, confident, concealing the ruin he had caused. He stood among gentlemen whose fortunes dwarfed his own, gesturing toward her like a merchant praising his finest porcelain. "A treasure, is she not?" he said, his tone a little too proud, a little too desperate. The gentlemen agreed, as men do when witnessing a transaction already decided. Her mother kept to the edges of the room, her face fixed in a brittle smile. Only Arabella noticed the faint trembling of her lace handkerchief. And then came the sound that silenced the violins, the echo of boot heels across marble, slow and measured. The Duke of Ashkam had arrived. Conversation thinned into murmurs as heads turned toward the doorway. He was taller than she remembered from the day of the betrothal, though perhaps it was only the gravity of his presence that made him seem so. His hair, silver at the temples, framed a face marked not by age but by the stillness of a man accustomed to command. There was nothing of cruelty in him, yet something colder than indifference, a quiet self-possession that unsettled those who sought his favor. The crowd parted as he approached, his gaze fixed upon her with an unreadable calm. Arabella curtsied deeply, the silk of her gown whispering across the floor. When she rose, his eyes, gray as dawn before rain, met hers. "Lady Arabella," he said, voice low, precise and resonant, as though he addressed not just her but fate itself. "I hope this evening has brought you some measure of happiness." "It has been memorable, your grace," she replied, her voice steady though her pulse betrayed her. Around them whispers bloomed like ivy. "She is too young. He is thrice her age. A fortune for a title, fair exchange." She heard every word, each one a thread tightening around her heart. The Duke offered his arm. She took it because she must, because the contract was already sealed by pen and debt and desperation. As they moved through the hall, the scent of roses and candle wax mingled with the sharp tang of envy. The prince's cousin remarked softly that the Duke's first wife had died of melancholia. A countess whispered that Arabella would follow soon after, beauty wasted upon gray hair and mourning halls. Arabella's smile did not falter. She had been trained too well for that. When the waltz began again, the Duke did not ask her to dance. Instead, he guided her toward the terrace, where the air was cold and honest. London shimmered in the distance, a sea of lamps flickering like uncertain stars. "I do not much care for crowds," he said. "Do you?" She hesitated. "I am told they are essential," she replied softly, "for a woman who wishes to be remembered." "And do you," he asked, "wish to be remembered?" She turned her face toward the dark gardens below, the moonlight tracing the outline of her throat. "I should like," she said after a pause, "to be more than an arrangement." He studied her then as though her words had unlatched something long sealed. "That is rarer than beauty, Lady Arabella," he murmured. "It is courage." His tone held no mockery. For the briefest moment she believed he saw her, not the dowry, not the porcelain mask, but the frightened girl behind it. Then a servant interrupted with news that the carriages had arrived, and the moment vanished like breath on glass. Hours later the ball had ended. London's laughter lingered in the streets, but inside the Fairfax carriage there was only the rattle of wheels and her mother's quiet sobbing. Arabella watched the city recede, the glow of the ballroom fading into fog. Her father snored beside them, drunk on relief rather than wine. She pressed her hand to the window pane, tracing the condensation with her fingertip. Her reflection stared back, Duchess to be, pawn of circumstance, savior of a name she did not bear proudly. She thought of the Duke's expression, his calm restraint, the strange kindness that felt almost like sorrow. A man both feared and pitied, offering her neither flattery nor false promise. It should have frightened her more than it did. Perhaps she was too tired to feel fear. Perhaps she had already surrendered to the inevitable. At home, the servants waited with tired smiles and candle stubs. Her bedchamber smelled faintly of lavender and ink. Someone had placed a sealed envelope on her vanity. Her name, written in the Duke's steady hand, gleamed beneath the wax seal. She hesitated before opening it, her heart unsteady. Inside, a single sheet of paper bore only one line. "Sleep peacefully, my lady. The world has taken enough from you tonight." There was no signature, no demand, no promise, only gentleness. She folded the note carefully, unsure whether to weep or smile. Outside, thunder rumbled distantly over the Thames. She sat by the window until dawn, watching the first pale light touch the rooftops. When her maid entered, she pretended to be asleep. By morning, London's gossip had already begun its next waltz. The papers praised the match as an elegant solution to unfortunate debts. The ladies at tea lamented youth sacrificed to wealth. The men called it a triumph of prudence. No one mentioned love. No one ever did. That afternoon she attended a fitting for her wedding gown, ivory silk, embroidered with silver thread that caught the light like water. The seamstress spoke of beauty, her mother of propriety, her aunt of duty. Only Arabella said nothing. When asked if she preferred lace or tulle, she whispered, "Whichever tears less easily." On the morning of her wedding, the bells of St. James tolled through the fog. The Duke waited at the altar, solemn, unreadable. When she approached, her veil trembling like a captive breath, she felt the eyes of London upon her. Her father's debts vanished with each step she took. So did her freedom. Yet when she reached the Duke's side, he looked at her, not as possession or prize, but as something fragile, perhaps even sacred. He bowed his head slightly, as though offering reverence instead of conquest. The vows passed in a blur of Latin and candle smoke. When he placed the ring upon her finger, his hand trembled just enough for her to notice. As they turned to face the congregation, the choir's hymn rose, a haunting echo of triumph and mourning interwoven. She caught sight of a countess whispering behind a fan, of a young officer smiling ruefully. All their faces blurred into one truth: the beautiful Duchess had married her future and buried her past in the same hour. That evening, as the carriage carried them toward Ashkam Hall, rain began to fall, soft, relentless, and purifying. Arabella leaned her head against the glass, watching droplets race like tears. Somewhere in the darkness ahead lay her new life, gilded yet unknown. And as the lightning flashed, she thought she saw, for an instant, the Duke watching her reflection instead of the road. She closed her eyes and whispered to herself, "Perhaps he too is lonely." The wheels turned faster, and the thunder swallowed her words. Rain veiled the carriage windows as it rolled through the iron gates of Ashkam Hall. Lady Arabella, now the Duchess, sat in stillness, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. The estate rose from the mist like a cathedral carved from time itself, solemn, vast, and old enough to have forgotten laughter. Its towers pierced the gray sky, and its gardens stretched endlessly, a labyrinth of roses glistening with rain. When the door opened, she stepped down into air thick with petrichor, her satin hem brushing against wet gravel. Somewhere within, the man she had married awaited her, not as husband, not yet even as companion, but as the keeper of a life she no longer recognized as her own. Inside, silence reigned. The hall smelled faintly of cedar and age. Portraits of solemn ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes following her with ancestral judgment. The Duke walked beside her without flourish, offering a brief nod to the butler who awaited them. "Her Grace will have the east wing," he said quietly. "See that the fire is kept." His voice held neither warmth nor cruelty, merely gravity, as though words themselves bowed to his restraint. Arabella inclined her head, uncertain whether gratitude or distance was expected. Her rooms were beautiful in a restrained way, ivory drapes, mahogany furniture, a fireplace carved with the Ashkam crest. Yet they felt less like a home and more like a gallery arranged for admiration. On the mantel lay a single object, a rose of pale porcelain resting within a glass dome. A note beside it read, "For when winter comes faster than one expects." There was no signature, yet she knew whose hand it was. She lifted the dome, touched the delicate petals, and wondered what it meant, that he pitied her, or that he saw her as something fragile worth preserving. Days blurred into a pattern of quiet civility. The Duke dined with her each evening, never unkind, never familiar. He asked after her comfort, her walks, her music, questions of habit, not intimacy. Yet his eyes lingered sometimes, as though measuring whether she could bear this life of polite distance. The servants spoke of him with a respect that bordered on reverence. His first wife, they said, had died 7 winters ago, and since then the master's heart had closed like a book unread. Arabella, hearing this whispered beyond her door, pressed her ear to the wood until the voices faded. London society, ever hungry for novelty, had turned its gaze toward her. Letters arrived daily, most laced with curiosity, some with cruelty. One afternoon, as she sat in the drawing-room surrounded by unopened envelopes, a carriage arrived bearing Lady Merryweather, her cousin and the Tun's most merciless observer. She swept and draped in lilac silk and false affection. "My dear, the world adores you," she began, eyes glittering, "though they cannot decide whether to envy or mourn you." Arabella smiled faintly. "And you, cousin, do you mourn or envy?" "Both," Lady Merryweather said, laughing softly. "They say you've tamed the ice duke. Or perhaps," she added with delicate malice, "you've simply joined his frost." The barb found its mark. That night, Arabella dined alone. The Duke had been called away on estate business. The long table stretched between her and the empty chair like a chasm. When the meal ended, she wandered through the halls until she found herself before a locked door at the corridor's end. Something in her, curiosity or defiance, drove her to try the handle. It turned easily. The room within was dim, dust veiling the furniture. On the mantel stood a faded portrait, a woman with kind eyes and a wistful smile. The late Duchess. Her features were gentle, her beauty ordinary, yet there was tenderness in her gaze that made Arabella ache. A sealed envelope rested beneath the frame, yellowed with age. It was addressed in a delicate hand, "To the next Duchess." Arabella froze. The house creaked around her as if aware of her trespass. She slipped the letter into her sleeve and fled before she could question why. The next morning, rain had turned to snow, frosting the rose garden in white. She found the Duke in his study, his sleeves rolled to the elbows as he reviewed ledgers. "You rise early, Your Grace," she said. He looked up, faint surprise softening his expression. "Habit. The estate tolerates no indolence, not even from its master." She hesitated, then approached the piano in the corner, a grand, neglected instrument. "May I?" "Of course," he replied, and she sat, her fingers trembling slightly over the keys. The melody she chose was soft, uncertain, a lullaby from her childhood. The sound filled the room like distant sunlight breaking through clouds. When she finished, the Duke spoke quietly. "That piano has been silent for years. I had it restored before your arrival." Her breath caught. "You did?" He gave a faint nod. "I thought music might make this house less lonely." Something in his tone disarmed her, the gentleness beneath his reserve. She rose, unsure whether to thank him or flee. "You are kind," she managed. "I am merely a man who has learned the cost of silence," he said. His gaze held hers until she felt warmth rise in her cheeks. She left quickly, though the echo of his words followed her down the corridor like a heartbeat. By evening, the gossip from London had reached even the servants' quarters. A newspaper lay open on the hall table, its headline cruelly elegant: "The Ashkam arrangement, beauty bartered for solvency." She read it standing in the lamplight, her face unreadable. The Duke appeared beside her, silent until she spoke. "They think me bought." He studied the words, then her expression. "And does it wound you?" "It should not," she said, her voice brittle. "They speak what all of England already knows." He closed the paper, folded it once, and tossed it into the fire. "They speak because they cannot imagine something purer than ambition." His voice dropped lower. "They will tire soon enough." But they did not. At a dinner 2 nights later, the whispers grew bolder. "Such a pity," murmured the Baroness across the table. "So radiant and yet miscast." Laughter followed, thin and poisonous. Arabella sat unmoving, her smile poised as the room blurred with humiliation. The Duke's hand tightened around his glass until it cracked. "That will do," he said sharply. The laughter died. He rose, offered his arm to his wife, and together they left the table. In the corridor's dim light, he stopped, turning toward her. "They will not speak of you so again," he said. "I am accustomed to whispers," she murmured. "You should not have to be," he replied, his tone softer now. "Cruelty is the pastime of the idle. But you," he paused as though choosing each word carefully, "you are not made for their games." She wanted to thank him, but the words tangled in her throat. He bowed slightly and left her standing beneath the chandelier, her reflection fractured in the crystal. When she finally returned to her chamber, she drew the letter from her sleeve, the one addressed to the next Duchess. The seal was unbroken, the paper brittle with time. Her heart pounded as she held it to the firelight. The wax glistened like blood before it cracked beneath her thumb. Candlelight trembled against the frost-blurred windows of Ashkam Hall. The fire in the Duke's study burned low, casting long shadows across the bookshelves where dust and memory had settled alike. Arabella stood before the hearth, the opened letter trembling in her hand. Its ink was faded, the script delicate and womanly, yet the words felt alive, pulsing through her like a confession from the grave. To the next Duchess, it began, if you are reading this, then you are as I once was, young, uncertain, and watched by a man whose silence can wound as much as it can protect. He is not unfeeling, though the world will tell you otherwise. Love him if you can, not with youth's fever but with patience. That is the only language his heart understands. Arabella read it twice, her breath quickening. The late Duchess had known the same loneliness, the same marble-cold quiet that filled these walls. She looked toward the door, then at the letter again, and felt the strange pull of defiance. Tonight she would confront him, not as bride or subject, but as equal, as woman to man. The corridor was silent as she walked, her silk skirts whispering over the rug. Beyond the study door came the faint scrape of pen against parchment. She hesitated, hand on the latch, gathering the courage that society never asked her to use. When she entered, the Duke looked up, startled only for an instant. His hair caught the firelight like tarnished silver. "Arabella," he said, the name sounding softer in his mouth than she had ever heard it. "You should be resting." "I found something," she said. Her voice was calm, though her pulse thundered in her throat. She stepped forward and placed the letter upon his desk. In her room. He looked at it without touching. For a long moment neither spoke. Then quietly he said, "You read it." "I did." A flicker crossed his expression, pain quickly buried beneath composure. "Then you know more of me than most living souls." "She loved you," Arabella said. "And she pitied you." He leaned back, eyes closed. "Pity?" he murmured. "The one affection I never sought." "Why keep it locked away?" she pressed. "Why preserve her memory and yet silence her words?" He opened his eyes again, meeting hers with a look both weary and searching. "Because some griefs are best kept unspoken. The letter was meant for a woman who might one day need it. You have found it sooner than I wished." The fire snapped between them. Arabella felt her composure fray. "I thought you hated her," she said, her voice trembling now. "The way you never speak her name, the way this house feels like mourning carved in stone." "Hate her?" he interrupted, rising from his chair. "No, my lady. I loved her far too gently. That was my mistake." She flinched at the intensity in his tone. "Too gently?" He walked to the window, watching snow drift against the glass. "She came to me much as you did, beautiful, frightened, bound by duty. I tried to shield her from a world she had already surrendered to. I gave her space when she wanted presence. I gave her courtesy when she longed for passion. And by the time I learned the difference, it was too late." His voice faltered on the last words. For the first time, Arabella saw him not as the feared Duke, but as a man exiled from his own tenderness. The silence that followed was heavy, intimate, almost sacred. She took a cautious step toward him. "Do you fear that I will become her?" He turned, his expression unreadable. "I fear that you already have." Her breath caught. "Then why marry me at all?" "Because," he said slowly, "when I first saw you, you looked at me without dread. Every other young woman in that ballroom saw a fortune or a monster. You saw a man." She felt her throat tighten. "I did not know what I saw," she whispered. "Only that you seemed, apart from the noise." He gave a small, sad smile. "Apart from the world, perhaps. It has its price." They stood facing one another, the air between them alive with something fragile and dangerous. The clock struck midnight. Outside the storm deepened. Arabella's fingers brushed the edge of the desk, steadying herself. "Your Grace," she said, her tone formal now, though her voice wavered. "Do you intend for us to live as strangers?" He studied her, his gaze searching hers for some unspoken truth. "Would you prefer a lie?" "I would prefer honesty," she said. "Even if it wounds me." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the faint scar near his temple, the tired lines around his eyes. "Honesty then," he said quietly. "I told myself this marriage would be my penance, that I would not ask more than civility, nor give more than duty. But you," he hesitated as if afraid of the word itself. "You unsettle me, Arabella. You make me remember what it is to want something I do not deserve." The fire cracked sharply. She felt heat rush to her face. "Deserve?" she echoed. "You speak as though kindness were sin." "For a man who has buried love once," he murmured, "it is." She could not look away. His voice had softened, but there was steel beneath it, a confession wrapped in restraint. "And what if I choose to forgive that?" she asked. He shook his head. "You cannot forgive what you do not yet understand." They stood in silence. The flames hissed, the clock ticked, and the air trembled with all that remained unsaid. Then she reached out, almost without thinking, and placed her hand upon the desk, between them, not touching, but close enough for the warmth of her skin to reach him. "I do not ask for love," she said softly. "Only for truth." He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. "Truth," he said, voice barely audible. "Then here is mine. I vowed never to love again. I thought myself safe behind that promise. But when you spoke at the altar, when you looked at me as if you did not fear what others feared, I felt the ground move beneath my feet. You remind me that I am still capable of feeling. And I resent it." Her eyes filled with tears she did not mean to shed. "Then resent me," she whispered. "But do not shut me away." The Duke's expression broke, just slightly, like light through cracked glass. He reached for the letter on the desk, held it between them. "She wrote that patience was the only language my heart understands," he said. Perhaps she was right. But even patience must begin somewhere. He placed the letter in her hands. "Keep it. Let it remind you that I am not a cruel man, only one still learning how to live among the living." Their eyes met, and for the first time neither looked away. Outside, the wind softened. Snow drifted against the windows like falling lace. The fire dimmed, its light turning gold, then ember red. She bowed her head slightly. "Then we begin here," she said. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "I will give you something you once lost." Her breath stilled. "What do you mean?" But he only smiled, tired, secretive, and impossibly gentle. "You will see," he said, turning back toward the window, where the first light of dawn glimmered faintly through the storm. And as the clock struck 1, Arabella stood in the fading firelight, the letter pressed to her chest, knowing that something had shifted between them, something fragile, unfinished, and entirely alive. Morning crept gently over Ashkam Hall, its pale light filtering through the embroidered curtains and painting gold upon the chamber walls. Arabella woke to silence broken only by the slow tick of the clock and the rustle of wind against the glass. For a moment she forgot who she was, only a woman wrapped in linen and dawn, until memory returned like the chill that seeped beneath the door. "Tomorrow I will give you something you once lost." His words had followed her through the night, through dreams filled with shadows of her childhood home. When she descended to breakfast, the Duke was waiting, dressed not in formality but in the quiet simplicity of a man with purpose. The firelight caught the fine lines near his eyes, softening their austerity. "You ride this morning, Duchess?" he said. "The horses are ready." "Ride?" she repeated, startled. "It is snowing." "Then we shall ride carefully," he replied. "There is something I wish you to see." He offered his arm. The gesture, once merely polite, felt different now, neither command nor request but invitation. She placed her hand upon it, gloved fingers trembling. Together they stepped into the cold. The air smelled of pine and frost, breath curled before them like smoke. 2 horses stood waiting, hers chestnut and spirited, his black as night. When he helped her mount, his touch lingered a fraction too long, steadying more than her balance. They rode through the frozen parkland, hooves muffled by snow. Ashkam Hall receded behind them, and the landscape widened into stillness, trees heavy with ice, the world reduced to silver and white. The Duke spoke little, but once, when she glanced at him, she saw the ghost of a smile. It was not the expression of a man fulfilling duty, it was the quiet satisfaction of someone nearing the end of a long hesitation. At last they reached a narrow lane that curved toward a hill. Beyond it, through the mist, she saw a familiar outline, the gables, the old oak gate, the little tower half in ruin. Her breath caught. "Fairhaven Manor?" she whispered. "But that cannot be." "It is," he said, dismounting. He walked to her side and held out his hand. "Come." She slid from the saddle, her boots sinking into snow. The manor stood before her, smaller than she remembered, lonelier, yet achingly dear. The very air seemed thick with her childhood laughter, the scent of lavender her mother once kept in the halls. She turned to him, eyes wide. "But it was sold. My father." "Lost it, yes," he said softly. "And now it is yours again." She stared, unable to speak. He drew from his coat a folded parchment, its seal glinting red in the light. "The deed," he said simply. "Transferred in your name. It is my first gift to you and perhaps the only one of worth." The paper trembled in her hands. "Why?" she breathed. "Why would you do this?" He looked at her with the same calm that had once unnerved her, but now it carried warmth, not distance. "Because I meant what I said that night. I would rather give you back your freedom than take what is not freely given." Tears blurred her vision. She turned toward the manor again, snow melting on her lashes. The wind caught her veil, lifting it like a banner of surrender. All my life, she said, voice breaking, I have belonged to something, a name, a reputation, a bargain. And now you undo it with a single act. I do not know how to thank you. Then do not, he replied. Simply live as though it were yours by right. Because it is. She looked at him then, truly looked, and saw not power but gentleness hard-won. Beneath the frost of his restraint lay a soul that had waited too long to be known. She took a step closer, her gloved hand rising to touch his sleeve. You could have commanded me, she said quietly. You never did. His lips curved faintly. A man commands where he fears he cannot earn. And you? She asked. I fear only that I have waited too long to tell you the truth. The snow fell softly between them, and for a heartbeat the world stilled. Then tell me, she whispered. He exhaled, a sound like surrender. I have loved you since the moment you refused to flatter me. You stood in that ballroom like a frightened child who would not beg. I admired you before I ever desired you. And when you looked at me at the altar, not as monster nor savior, but simply as man, it was the first mercy I had known in years. Her tears spilled freely now, each one catching the pale morning light. You love me? She repeated, as if testing the word's reality. I do, he said. But I would rather die unloved than loved by force. She could not answer. The snow gathered in her hair, and he reached out, brushing it away with a touch so light it broke her. Arabella, he said, his voice unsteady for the first time. You owe me nothing. Not affection, not loyalty. But if ever you should find peace here, then my life has not been in vain. Something inside her, pride, fear, every lesson taught by London's cruel salons, shattered. She stepped closer, her hand trembling as she lifted it to his cheek. Then perhaps, she said, voice barely above breath, my heart is already yours. For an instant he stood motionless, as though the world had tilted. Then he bowed his head until their foreheads touched, his hands resting lightly at her waist, no claim, only reverence. The silence between them deepened into something sacred. The wind sighed through the trees. A bell tolled distantly from the village below. She felt his breath warm against her skin. We should return, he murmured, though neither moved. When they finally did, the journey back was wordless, each glance heavy with all they could not yet name. That evening, the house was lit with hundreds of candles, their reflections trembling on the polished floors. The servants spoke in whispers, for the Duke had ordered a supper laid in the east wing, a room long untouched. The piano gleamed anew, its lid open, fresh roses placed atop it. As Arabella entered, her gown of soft ivory trailing behind her, she paused at the sight of him waiting beside the fire. He looked not older now but ageless, as though some quiet absolution had freed him. I had thought, he said, that tonight might belong to you alone. She smiled faintly. Then let it begin. He reached for her hand, and together they crossed to the hearth. The snow outside pressed gently against the windows, blurring the world into silence. You once asked, he said, whether we were to live as strangers. I give you my answer now. He kissed her hand, once lightly as one might honor something sacred. You are no longer a stranger, Arabella. You are the reason this house has woken from its grief. Her tears came softly, without shame. She leaned into him, the rhythm of his heart steady beneath her ear. For the first time since her girlhood, she felt safe, not caged, not bartered, but seen. Outside, dawn began to gather again, pale and promising. But even as warmth settled between them, the sound of carriage wheels echoed from beyond the gate, a visitor at an hour too strange to be innocent. The Duke turned his head slightly, the fire catching in his eyes. Arabella's fingers tightened around his. Who would come now? She whispered. He did not answer, only listened, the faintest tension stealing into his stillness. And in that quiet moment, as the last candle guttered, the fragile peace they had built trembled, waiting to see whether it would hold. The carriage that had broken the night's peace arrived beneath a sky bruised with stormlight. Its lamps flickered, scattering gold across the snow, and Arabella's heart thudded with a nameless dread. The Duke stepped forward first, his expression unreadable but tense, as if the past itself had come calling. When the door opened, a figure emerged, an older man wrapped in a wool cloak, his boots caked with London's grime. Your Grace, the visitor said, bowing stiffly. Forgive the intrusion. I come on behalf of Lord Fairfax. Arabella's breath stilled. My father? The messenger hesitated, eyes flicking between them. His debts have worsened. The crown has seized his estate. He is to be imprisoned at dawn unless, he faltered, unless restitution is made in full. The silence stretched, broken only by the crackle of fire behind them. The Duke's jaw tightened. How much? The number, when spoken, struck like a blade. Even for him it was vast. Arabella swayed, gripping the banister for balance. The messenger bowed again and withdrew, leaving cold air and dread in his wake. Arabella turned to her husband. "You cannot," she said. "You have given too much already." He looked at her, eyes shadowed. "He is your father. And you are not his creditor," she replied fiercely. "He sold my future once. I will not let him sell my soul again." But by morning the Duke was gone. When she descended the stairs, the servants murmured of horses taken and documents sealed. On the writing desk lay a single envelope addressed to my wife. Her hands shook as she opened it. "Do not come after me. Some debts are not measured in coin. I will return when it is done." The ink was smudged as if written in haste or sorrow. Arabella pressed the letter to her lips, fighting the rush of fear that hollowed her chest. Outside, snow thickened to a storm. 2 days passed. The winds howled over Ashkam Hall. Fires burned low. At dusk, she could bear the waiting no longer. Donning a cloak, she rode out beneath the gathering dark, the road barely visible beneath the white. Her horse labored against the storm, hooves sinking deep, until at last she saw the glow of a village inn and the shadow of 2 figures beneath its eaves. The Duke stood there, coat dusted with snow, facing a man who looked broken by years and vice, her father. Between them lay a small trunk. Coins glinted faintly within. Arabella dismounted, her voice trembling. "Stop this." Both men turned. Her father's eyes, once proud, were red-rimmed and desperate. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped. "He's paying my sentence in gold." "I'm buying your peace," the Duke corrected quietly. "That is all." "No," she said, stepping between them. "Not like this. You cannot redeem what refuses to change." Her father's hand shook as he reached for the trunk. "You don't understand, Bella." "I understand enough," she cut in, tears freezing on her lashes. "You sold me to survive. And now you would let him buy you to ease your shame. I will not let either of you do this." The Duke's gaze softened, but his voice was steady. "Arabella, step back." She refused. "If you do this, you undo everything we have become. You taught me that love is freedom. Don't make it sacrifice." The wind surged, carrying her words into the snow. The Duke closed the trunk slowly. His gloved hands lingered there before he turned to Lord Fairfax. "You will not see prison," he said. "But you will sign away what remains of your holdings, to her. You have taken enough from her life." Her father stared, bewildered. "You would leave me penniless?" "Alive," the Duke answered. "That will be enough." The old man sagged against the doorframe, weeping softly into his hands. Arabella wanted to hate him, but only pity came, a pity that no longer hurt. When the carriage took her father away toward London, the snow eased, leaving the world hushed and bare. The Duke watched the road until the last lantern disappeared, then turned toward her. "You should not have come," he said gently. "You knew I would," she replied. He smiled faintly, weary but proud. "So I did." They rode home in silence. The storm clouds broke as they neared the estate, revealing a pale ribbon of dawn. Inside, the servants greeted them with astonishment, the hall once more bright with firelight. In the study, he poured her wine, though his hands trembled slightly. "You think me a fool, I suppose?" he said. "I think you a man who no longer hides behind silence," she answered. He met her gaze, and in that moment, all the restraint between them seemed to dissolve. "When I first married you, I meant to give you comfort, not love," he said. "But comfort cannot heal the living. You woke something in me I thought buried forever." Her throat tightened. "Then let it live." He took her hand. "Only if you wish it." She rose, standing before him. "I do." The clock struck noon, and somewhere deep in the house, a bell chimed. He drew her close, slowly, reverently, as though afraid the moment might break. Their first kiss was not of passion but of promise, a quiet sealing of all that had been withheld. The world beyond the window glimmered with thawing snow. Weeks later, London whispered again, of a Duchess who had tamed the coldest of men, of a Duke who now smiled at balls, who danced when he once only watched. Society wondered, as it always did, what alchemy had transformed them. The truth, of course, was simpler. 2 wounded hearts had chosen mercy over pride. At the spring reception at Carlton House, the ton gathered beneath chandeliers, gossiping like caged birds. Arabella entered on her husband's arm, her gown pale blue, her expression calm. When a viscount whispered, "A miracle she survived such a match," the Duke turned, his voice low but sharp. "She did not survive me," he said. "She saved me." The words rippled through the hall. Even the Prince Regent paused, glass in hand, as if acknowledging something sacred. Later, when the musicians began a slow waltz, the Duke extended his hand. "May I, Duchess?" Her smile held the faintest tremor. "Always." They danced beneath the chandeliers, the crowd parting around them. Each step was grace, each turn forgiveness. The whispers faded into applause, then into awe. For the first time in years, laughter reached his eyes. As the night waned, they slipped outside to the terrace. The city shimmered beneath them, alive and endless. "We have given them quite the spectacle," she said softly. "Let them have it," he replied. "They thrive on illusion. We live in truth." She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the river glint beneath moonlight. "Do you think they will remember us kindly?" He smiled, pressing a kiss to her hair. "History rarely remembers kindness. But love, it endures even when forgotten." The bells of St. James tolled midnight, echoing across the city that had once judged them. She turned in his arms, eyes bright. "Then let them forget," she whispered. "So long as we remember." He drew her closer, the faint scent of roses and snow between them. Far below, carriages clattered over cobblestones, carrying gossip into dawn. But within the marble silence of the terrace, there was only the sound of two hearts, steady and at peace. And as the first light touched London's rooftops, the narrator's voice seemed to echo through time. In an age that worshipped appearances, they chose devotion. And she, once the most beautiful Duchess, found that the truest love was not in youth's fire, but in a man who had learned how to love her gently. The light widened, spilling over their clasped hands. The city blurred to gold. And somewhere deep in Ashkam Hall, the piano began to play again.